All right, this is Chapter 7 of Diversity and Equity in the Classroom by Valerie Ukapeng. This chapter talks about human diversity and specifically focuses on sexual orientation and gender identity. So the chapter opens up with the evolution of diversity and how, we've gone through multiple stages from racism to dealing with the LGBTQ community and dealing with gender identity and sexual orientation. And so it kind of gives us an idea of how we've progressed through there. And so before, diversity was just simply defined as race and color, which is considered a socio-political construct, something that's just been built by society to define, the distinguishing features that differentiated us. But of course, it has gone much further than that. However, if we look at media, we see examples of how the representation of diversity has evolved over time. So we see The Cosby Show in 1984. It was one of the few shows that featured an affluent black family. Both parents in this family were professionals living in a middle-class suburban city. And so it was very different for that time, especially as we've been pulling away from segregation. 25 years later, Modern Family came out in 2009, in which featured a wife of the main character was a Colombian Spanish-speaking woman, and there was a gay couple as well as a gay son in the show. So we start to see the evolution of diversity start to include, this LGBTQ community. In the same year, Glee came out, which had even a more diverse representation, ranging from ethnicity and race and ability or disability and sexual orientation and identity and class. And so we see this whole smorgasbord of what is actually accurate to reality in our high schools. And of course, many times these differences aren't always projected as loudly as on the show, but many of the issues and struggles that they deal with throughout the episodes is quite accurately reflective of reality in our schools today. And Orange is the New Black is another amazing show in which a transgender character, you get to see the issues that she dealt with outside of prison, and then those issues don't go away as she goes into prison. Even in an all female prison, of course, it created complications because she was once a man that transitioned into a woman, and now she's dealing with getting like the proper dosage of hormone pills while in the prison cells, and dealing with being a man before, but then do the women feel comfortable with her there now that she identifies as a woman. So sexual orientation was studied by Alfred C. Kinsey. He was a zoologist in the early 20th century. And whereas prior to his focusing on this subject, it was generally taken through, sexual orientation was generally taken through a medical perspective. And a lot of times it was labeled as a mental disorder. However, Alfred decided to focus on interviewing and gathering data about human behavior. And through that, he actually discovered that a lot more men have had gay sexual experiences or had this gay identity, and he created this heterosexual homosexual rating scale. While this was argued to have increased acceptance for homosexuality and the books he sold did prove to be successful, many researchers have stated that it was methodologically flawed and could have even been based on his own insecurities. And so it really helped, though, define that it is more about sexual behaviors or lifestyle of an individual. And so what is sexual orientation? We have two definitions here. One's like a modern definition, and then there's another definition that is provided from like a researcher's perspective. And so a modern definition defines it as the sex of those whom one is sexually romantic or attracted to. However, it's not always as definable as male, I'm attracted to male, or I'm attracted to female. They call that a continuum because there's a broad spectrum of different attractions that can range, or more than one attractions can be involved. Now, modern researchers' definition, they define it as a complex construct that includes gender identity, culture, history, political advocacy, social community, and psychological changes. And so it's important that when you view sexual orientation, you don't look at it strictly through a sexual lens because it really narrows the meaning. As you can see in this definition, it is much more than that. And now the LGBTQ is a very popular community that represents the vast majority of people that are involved within this community and subculture, and they represent these common aspects of humanity. And so it is not correct to call this a mental illness, in that it is actually a very diverse cultural group that involves its own histories and its own languages and identities and attitudes and viewpoints. So talking about subcultures, even within the LGBTQ, there are so many different identities that individuals can identify with within that culture itself. And so within there, you even have even more subcultures that are involved. And Val's model of culture really helps us to understand how we can come to understanding these subcultures. And it breaks it down into three stages. And so the first stage is just the observable cultural aspects. And so the clothing they wear, the language they use, the music they listen to, specifically the rainbow flag or going out into Pride Parade. These are observable things that we can see to help us understand this culture. The next stage is interactional patterns, behaviors, and this can be exemplified greatly through the same-sex weddings and the practices that they use within there. They don't follow the traditional forms of marriage. They typically will find a justice of peace or a friend to marry them instead of getting a cleric. And typically they don't have any religious aspect to them. They don't get married at a church. They'll get married at a park or at the beach or in the woods or at a friend's house. And a lot of times don't even walk down the aisle, which, you think of a marriage, you think, oh, walking down the aisle is like a pinnacle part of that tradition. Well, cultures can define how they wish to get married and go through this process of a wedding. Now, the final stage is values, and this is what you consider to be like one of the deepest values. Observable is like a surface value and understanding of this culture, while values, you're really digging into the core of it. And for the LGBTQ community specifically, you see a very strong outpour for equality and freedom, democracy, and demanding civil rights. So gender identity. In gender identity, we have gender versus gender identity. So gender is the roles that are given by culture to define a person's biological sex. So you're born, you're given a gender, and then you're expected to fulfill the roles that are defined by that gender. Now, gender identity is oneself of oneself as male, female, or transgender. So I may have been born this way, but as I've grown, I've come to realize that I identify with a different gender than the one that I've been assigned. And so this process involves these two opposing factors. One is coming out and one is closeted. And so coming out is when an individual acknowledges, accepts, and actually discloses their own sexual orientation to family and friends. While closeted is the opposite, the state of secrecy and privacy of one's own sexual orientation. And it's typically because they are afraid or they feel ashamed to reveal this to their family and friends. They're fearful of how others may react. So sexual identity. You can focus on the sex, where we look at the intimate relationships that are involved in the biology, the body parts and chromosomes that we're born with. However, it's important to keep in mind that gender identity and sexual identity are not the same. Some believe these to be interchangeable, but this comes into conflict when those whose sexual and gender identity do not match up. So you may have been born with a certain gender role and what you identify with, but this doesn't always match with what your sexual identity is. And so we have gender conformity, where when you're born and given a role, you conform to the demands of that role. And there's this peer pressure of being what is defined as normal. However, as you come to realize your own identity, a lot of times this conflicts with what is normal in your community or your society. And of course that can change based on where you live and what groups you're involved with and who your friends and family are and their perspectives on this. And so this process of either remaining closeted with your identity or coming out can be defined can be looked through this perspective of this gay identity development stages by Vivian Cass. And she creates this model that helps us to understand it. While Kinsey's model is based on sexual experiences, this model kind of focuses on individuals as they ask themselves who they are and which community they identify with. And so there's an initial dimension where you have this identity confusion. You're having these feelings and thoughts that may be gay in nature, but you're not sure. And then you have identity comparison, where you actually seek out others to identify with and hopefully build connections and relationships with those that share these thoughts. You have the middle stage, which is identity tolerance, where you start to get a realization and a tolerance for your own thoughts that may be a gay identity. Stage 4, we have this identity acceptance, and now this is a slow acceptance though. And so many times individuals may still act heterosexual because they have these feelings of shame. They still are scared to come out. They still want to closet these feelings and these thoughts. And then you have the final stage, which is identity pride, where you're now proud of this gay identity. And you may still feel resentment towards heterosexuality because you feel that, they held you back. They made you feel afraid and shamed and closeted. And you take that emotion and you promote for equality for gays. But then when you get to stage 6, you have this identity synthesis, and that is a realization that is not gays versus heterosexuals. And generally when you take this tension away, individuals feel at peace with themselves and with society, and that they are so much more than what their gay identity is. So LGBTQ community, some major issues. If we look back at 1966, we see the Defense of Marriage Act, which basically said that legalized marriage can only be defined as a man marrying a woman, and that same-sex marriage was effectively made illegal. And in Ireland in 2015, which was not long ago, we actually had the first country to legalize same-sex marriage by popular vote, which is a huge thing, especially when you take in mind that Ireland has strong Catholic origins. And so a lot of the strongest proponents or supporters of same-sex marriage have been religious organizations. So to see a country that has strong religious origins actually legalize same-sex marriage by popular vote, that is like a big deal to show the progression of the acceptance of this LGBTQ community and what they value. Moving on with LGBTQ issues, we look at education and bullying in schools. Here we see the term homophobia, which is basically having this fear of gay, lesbian, transgender, bisexual, and queer people. And some other reasons beyond homophobia may be just an individual's lack of empathy for others' thoughts and feelings. Maybe they bullied as like a stress outlet, or maybe they use it as intimidation to feel power over someone, and then that gives them value. However, there are many ways that we as educators and individuals can address bullying. One way to address bullying is establishing a gay-straight alliance club, and this has been proven to show that when a gay-straight alliance club is established in a school, it actually reduces the incidences between LGBTQ community. Also, integrating LGBTQ curriculum into your lesson plans and establishing positive role models really helps, create representation and understanding. Establishing policies against bullying based on sexual orientation, being strict, having zero tolerance for this type of behavior, and of course being supportive of those that are within this community or those that are straight but they are allies. They ally themselves with the values and individuals that are involved in this community. And that just about wraps up chapter 7.